The colonel's hand froze halfway to his wine glass. His eyes locked on me like he'd seen a ghost climb out of a grave and put on a sport coat. "Hello," he said slowly. "I'm surprised to see you here. Who are you to them?" The whole table went quiet. Forks stopped mid-air. My mother's smile cracked down the middle like old plaster. And I just stood there, in a rented banquet room, smelling like candle wax and overpriced salmon, thinking, this is either going to be the best night of my life, or my mother is going to disown me before dessert. Turned out to be both. Welcome back. Pour your coffee, settle in, and get ready. Because in these stories, karma always finds the address. Subscribe so you never miss what happens next. My name is Howard Langley. I'm 43 years old. I run a small furniture restoration workshop 2 blocks off State Street in Santa Barbara, and for most of my adult life, my own mother has treated me like a stain she couldn't quite scrub out of the family carpet. I didn't know it yet, but that stain was about to become the loudest thing in the room. My mother's name is Eloise. She's 67, silver-haired, sharp-tongued, and she has spent 3 decades perfecting the art of the backhanded compliment. She raised 2 sons. My younger brother Delaney is 37, a corporate attorney with a corner office and a jaw that looks good in photographs. I am the older one, the one who came home from the army with a limp and a workshop full of sawdust instead of a law degree and a signing bonus. My mother never said it outright. She didn't have to. She said it in the way she introduced us at parties. "This is Delaney, my son the attorney," she'd say, beaming, one hand on his shoulder like he was a trophy she'd won at a raffle. Then, almost as an afterthought, gesturing vaguely in my direction, "And this is Howard. He does woodworking. He does woodworking." Like I was a hobbyist. Like I hadn't spent 6 years in the army before I ever touched a lathe. Like the limp I walked with wasn't a souvenir from a night in Afghanistan that I never talked about, not even to her. I could give you a dozen examples if you wanted them. The birthday dinner where she spent 40 minutes describing the details of Delaney's bar exam results to a table of relatives who had already heard the story twice, and then, when someone politely asked what I'd been up to, answered for me, "Oh, Howard's still doing his little projects out of that garage." It wasn't a garage. It was a leased commercial space with proper ventilation and a waiting list of clients. But details like that never seemed to matter to her once she'd decided what kind of son I was. There was the year Delaney made partner track at his firm, and she rented out a private room at a restaurant downtown, hired a photographer, had a cake made with the firm's logo piped onto it in blue frosting. I got a card in the mail the year I opened the workshop. Not even a call. A card, with a picture of a hammer on the front, and inside, in her looping handwriting, "Hope this works out for you, sweetheart." Like I'd taken up a risky hobby instead of building something from nothing with my own 2 hands. Constance used to say my mother wasn't cruel so much as she was allergic to anything she couldn't easily explain to other people. Delaney was easy to explain. Attorney. 1 word, and everyone nodded, impressed, moved on. I was harder. Combat medic turned furniture restorer with a limp he won't discuss didn't fit neatly into small talk. So she'd trimmed me down to the only part of my life she could summarize in 3 words, and left the rest of it on the cutting room floor. My wife Constance used to grip my hand under the table every time my mother did it. She'd squeeze once, hard, like she was trying to send a message through my knuckles. Don't let her get to you. Most nights, it worked. The evening before that 2 a.m. phone call, I'd spent working late on a roll-top desk for a client out near the Mission. A piece that had come to me with 3 broken drawer slides and a water stain the size of a dinner plate across the top, the kind of damage most people would have thrown out rather than fixed. I liked those jobs best. Something about taking an object everyone else had written off and proving, slowly, with enough patience, that it still had use left in it. Constance used to joke that I had a type, and it wasn't really furniture. She'd come by the shop around closing that evening with 2 coffees, the way she sometimes did when she got restless at home, and sat on the stool by my workbench watching me sand down the desk's top in long, even strokes. "You ever think about telling her?" she asked, apropos of nothing, the way Constance's best questions always arrived, sideways, when you weren't braced for them. "Telling who what?" "Your mother." About the medal, about any of it. Just sitting her down and saying it plainly, instead of letting her keep building whatever version of you she's decided to believe in. I kept sanding, the fine dust settling on my forearms, catching the last of the evening light through the skylight. I tried that once, years ago. She interrupted me to ask about a caterer. I know, I was there. Constance took a sip of her coffee. I just mean, maybe it's time to try again. People change. Some people, I said. Not her. Not about this. Constance didn't argue. She'd known my mother long enough by then to understand that some doors don't open, no matter how many times you knock, and the only thing knocking accomplishes is bruising your own knuckles. We closed up the shop together a little after dark, the smell of sawdust and varnish following us out into the parking lot, and neither of us had any idea that a phone call was coming that would answer her question for us, whether my mother liked it or not. That night it wasn't going to matter, because my mother had already decided the rules before we even walked in the door. The phone rang at 2 a.m, and I knew before I answered it that it was her. Nobody else calls a grown man at 2 a.m, except a mother who has never once considered that other people sleep. Howard, no greeting. Just my name, clipped and urgent, like she was reporting a fire. It's the middle of the night, I said, rubbing my eyes, Constance stirring beside me. Tomorrow you're coming to dinner. Delaney's fiancé's family wants to meet everyone before the wedding. You can come, but I need you to keep your mouth shut. I sat up. Keep my mouth shut about what? Her father's a decorated colonel, my mother said, and I could hear the reverence dripping off the word colonel like she was talking about royalty. Retired now, but still very respected. Don't embarrass us, Howard. Just smile, eat your dinner, and don't bring up the army stuff. The army stuff. 6 years of my life reduced to 2 words she said the way other people say that unfortunate business or the incident. Got it, I said. I mean it. Don't make this about you. Got it, I said again, quieter this time, because there was no point arguing with a woman who had already written the script for how the evening would go, and my role in it was silent extra number 4. I hung up, and Constance rolled over, squinting at me in the dark. Let me guess, she said. Keep your mouth shut, don't embarrass the family, smile for the nice colonel. Word for word, I said. Constance sat up on one elbow. She's 41, sharp as a tack, and she has hated my mother with a slow, patient hatred for the better part of 15 years. The kind of hatred that doesn't yell, just watches and remembers everything. One of these years, she said, that woman is going to find out who she's been talking down to. I laughed, because it seemed impossible. My mother had built an entire identity around the idea that Delaney was the success, and I was the disappointment. And no dinner party, no colonel, no fiancé's family was going to shake that loose. You know what gets me, Constance said, lying back against the pillow, staring at the ceiling fan turning slow circles above us. It's not even that she thinks you're less than him. It's that she's never once been curious enough to find out if that's true. 15 years married to you, and I've heard more about your service from Paxton, your old squad leader at that reunion 2 years ago, than I've ever heard your own mother ask you directly. He spent 20 minutes telling me stories you'd never once mentioned at home, and your mother was sitting 3 feet away the whole time, checking her phone. She doesn't ask because she already thinks she knows the answer, I said. Easier that way, no surprises. Well, Constance turned onto her side, facing me in the dark. I hope tomorrow surprises the hell out of her. I didn't sleep much after that. I lay there, running through everything I hadn't said to my mother over the years. Every half-started sentence she'd interrupted. Every silence I'd let stand, because arguing with her felt like arguing with a wall that had already decided the shape of the conversation before I opened my mouth. By the time the sun came up over the workshop skylight and the coffee maker started its low gurgle in the kitchen, I'd made peace with the idea that tonight would be exactly like every other family dinner. Polite, managed, my mother steering the conversation like a woman driving a car with the emergency brake half engaged, and me sitting quietly in the passenger seat the way I always did. I didn't know it yet, but I was wrong. Dead wrong. And in less than 24 hours, I was going to watch that identity collapse in front of an entire dining room. Here's what my mother didn't know, because she never asked. Here's what my brother didn't know, because he never cared enough to find out. In my 20s, before the workshop, before Constance, before any of it, I was a combat medic. I enlisted at 20, did 2 tours, and on my second deployment, our convoy hid an eyed outside a stretch of road nobody back home will ever hear the name of. The vehicle in front of ours took the worst of it. Metal, fire, and a noise I still hear sometimes when a car backfires too close. I remember the order things happened in more than I remember the time passing. The blast came first. A wall of pressure that felt less like a sound and more like the air itself shoving you sideways. Then the deafening ringing. Then the smell, diesel, mixed with something sharper underneath that I'd learned by then not to think too hard about. Our vehicle lurched to a halt. For a few seconds, complete silence. That heavy quiet right before people start shouting. There was a major in that lead vehicle, older than most of the men around him, remarkably calm on the radio. Hearing his voice made the rest of us calmer, but he was pinned in the wreckage. The front end was already burning. Every bit of my training said the smart move was to wait for the fire team to clear a path first. I didn't wait. You don't always wait. Not when you hear a man calling for help and every second spent deciding brings him closer to dying. I got him out. I earned burns across both hands, and one on the side of my neck that Constance still traces with her thumb sometimes when she thinks I'm asleep. A piece of shrapnel took a chunk out of my hip that never healed right, the very limp my mother had ignored for 15 years. I talked to him the entire time we waited on that stretch of dirt for the medevac helicopter. Not about anything important, just a fishing trip my father used to take me on as a kid. The kind of nothing conversation you have with someone when silence is the enemy. He kept his eyes open and kept talking back, which was how I knew he was staying with us. The major lived. He went on to make full colonel a few years later. I went home with a medical discharge, a silver star I keep in a drawer instead of on a wall, and a family that decided the whole experience was something best not brought up at dinner parties. I spent the better part of a year afterward relearning how to walk without favoring the hip, how to sleep without startling awake when a car door slammed outside, how to be a person in a quiet town again instead of a soldier in a loud war. Santa Barbara helped with that. The ocean has a way of making everything else feel smaller. I never told my family the details, not because I was ashamed, but because every time I tried, my mother's eyes would glaze over like I was describing a plumbing problem. Eventually, I just stopped trying. Some stories you stop telling not because they don't matter, but because you get tired of watching them land on deaf ears. The colonel's name was Whitaker. I didn't know, walking into that dinner, that Colonel Whitaker was about to walk right back into my life, or that his daughter, the woman my brother was about to marry, had a father who'd spent 17 years trying to track down the medic who saved him, never knowing his last name, because no one stopped to make formal introductions in the chaos of triage. The dinner was held in a private room inside the Danvers Club, an old harborside establishment, with dark wood paneling, white tablecloths, and a string quartet nobody was listening to. My mother had dressed for the occasion like she was meeting the president, a navy suit, pearls, hair set so stiff it could have stopped a bullet. She met us at the entrance before we'd even fully stepped inside, one hand landing on my forearm like a leash. "Remember," she said, low under the noise of the room, "smile. Be pleasant. And if anyone asks what you do, keep it simple. You restore furniture. That's it. We don't need a whole story." It wasn't going to be a whole story, I said. It's usually 3 words. "I'm serious, Howard. So am I." Constance stepped past both of us without a word, heading straight for the bar, which was, I'd come to learn over 15 years of marriage, her version of a diplomatic exit from a conversation she had no intention of participating in. Delaney was already there when we made it further into the room, standing a little too straight next to his fiancée Harmony, a poised woman in her late 20s with her father's steady eyes. He looked good in a suit the way he always had. The kind of good that comes from a tailor and a gym membership, rather than any particular effort of his own. He caught my eye across the room, and gave me the nod he always gave me at these things, friendly enough, distant enough, the nod of a man who loved his brother, in theory, more than he'd ever bothered to in practice. "Howard," he said, shaking my hand when I reached him. "Glad you could make it." "Wouldn't miss it," I said, which wasn't entirely a lie, though not for the reasons he assumed. Harmony smiled warmly at me, shook my hand, and told me she'd heard so much about the family. "Not about me, I'm guessing," I said, half joking. Harmony blinked, caught off guard by the honesty, then laughed. "Well, I heard you do woodworking. There it was, even second-hand. My mother's script traveled ahead of me like a bad review. Something like that, I said. An older relative of Harmony's, an aunt I hadn't met before that night, drifted over with a glass of champagne and inserted herself into the conversation the easy way people do at engagement dinners, assuming everyone present is fair game for small talk. And you're the brother, she said, looking me over. Eloise mentioned you walk with a bit of a limp. Old sports injury? Something like that, I said again. The same 3 words doing the same quiet work they always did, smoothing over a story I'd stopped bothering to correct years ago. Terrible luck, the aunt said, shaking her head sympathetically. Already half turned towards someone else across the room, the way people do when they've asked a polite question and gotten exactly the polite non-answer they expected. Well, it's lovely you could come tonight regardless. She drifted off toward the bar, and I caught Constance's eye from across the room, where she stood nursing a glass of wine. Watching the whole exchange with the particular expression she reserved for moments she found more absurd than upsetting. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. 15 years of marriage had given us a whole language built out of looks like that one. My mother swooped in before I could say anything else, hooking her arm through mine like we were the closest pair of siblings in the state of California, instead of 2 people who'd exchanged maybe 6 real sentences in the past year. Howard, sweetheart, come meet the Colonel, and remember what we talked about. I remember, I said. We walked toward the head of the room, where an older man stood with his back to us, talking with the maitre d'. Silver hair cropped military short, shoulders set like a man who'd spent 30 years being the calmest person in every room he entered. Colonel, my mother said, her voice pitched up into a register I only ever heard her use around people she wanted something from. I'd love for you to meet my son. The Colonel turned, and everything in that room slowed down to a crawl. His eyes moved over my mother, polite and distant, the way you look at someone you've just met. Then they moved to me, and something in his face changed. Not confusion. Recognition. The kind of recognition that hits a person like a physical weight. Like all the air just left the space between us. Hello, he said slowly, his wine glass frozen halfway to his lips. I'm surprised to see you here. Who are you to them? The room fell dead silent. My mother's smile faltered. Just for a second, that flicker of weight. This isn't in the script. He's my son, she said, laughing a little too brightly, trying to smooth the moment over before it had a chance to become a moment at all. Howard, I know who he is, Colonel Whitaker said, and his voice had dropped into something quieter, something that made the whole table lean in without meaning to. I've spent 17 years trying to find this man. I didn't know it yet, but the next 4 minutes were going to unravel 15 years of my mother's careful little narrative in front of everyone she'd invited to witness her family's triumph. 17 years, Colonel Whitaker repeated, setting his glass down with the kind of deliberate care that told me his hands weren't entirely steady. You pulled me out of a burning vehicle outside. He stopped himself, glancing at Harmony, at the rest of the room, choosing his words the way career military men choose words in front of civilians. You pulled me out of a vehicle that should have killed me. You held pressure on a wound in my chest with your own jacket because we'd run out of gauze. You talked to me the entire ride to that evac point because you said if I stopped talking, you'd stop believing I was still with you. My mother's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. I'm sorry, she said, a small, strangled laugh escaping her. I think there's some kind of... Howard doesn't. He does woodworking. He does woodworking, Colonel Whitaker repeated, and for the first time all night, I heard something sharp underneath the calm. Ma'am, with respect. Your son is a Silver Star recipient. He was a combat medic for 6 years. He saved my life on a road I still can't drive past without my hands shaking, and I have spent 17 years trying to find the man who did it so I could shake his hand and thank him properly. And here he is, at my daughter's engagement dinner, being introduced to me like he refinishes end tables. Delaney had gone very still beside Harmony, his jaw tight as he stood there, processing everything in real time. Howard, he said, quiet, almost accusing, like I'd been hiding something from him rather than simply never being asked. You told us you got hurt in a training accident. A training accident. That was the story my mother had settled on years ago, back when I'd tried, once, to explain what actually happened, and she'd interrupted me halfway through to ask whether the caterer for Delaney's law school graduation party had confirmed the shrimp cocktail. I'd let the training accident story stand after that because it was easier than fighting for space in a family that had already decided how much of it I deserved. I didn't tell you a lot of things, I said. Nobody asked. Constance's hand found mine under the table. She didn't squeeze this time. She just held on, steady, like she'd been waiting 15 years for this exact dinner to happen. Colonel Whitaker wasn't finished. I could see it in the way he squared his shoulders, the way a man does right before he says something he's been rehearsing in his head for a very long time. Do you know, he said, addressing the table now, not just me, that after I made it home, I put in 3 separate requests to track down the medic from that convoy? Military records are a mess after a mass casualty event. Names get lost. I only had a physical description, and the fact that he talked about a fishing trip his father used to take him on to keep me calm while we waited for the helicopter. I felt my stomach drop. That was true. I remembered it, talking about nothing, filling silence with anything that wasn't the sound of the fire. Because silence was when men stopped fighting to stay alive. I gave up looking. Eventually, Whitaker continued. Figured maybe he didn't want to be found. Some men don't, after what happens out there. I understood that. But I never stopped telling the story. I told my daughter about him. I told her someday if she ever met a man who carried himself like he had nothing left to prove, because he'd already proven it where it mattered, that was the kind of man worth marrying. Harmony was staring at me now, reassessing her entire perception of our family in real time. And here I am, Whitaker said, turning back to me directly, meeting my future son-in-law's older brother, at my own daughter's engagement dinner, and I'm told by his mother, his own mother, to remember that he does woodworking. He let that sentence sit in the room like a stone dropped into still water. My mother tried to speak. Colonel, I had no idea. He's very private about. He's private, Whitaker said, because it sounds like nobody in this family ever gave him a reason to be anything else. Short sentences now. The room holding its breath. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I just stood there, in a room full of people who'd known me my whole life, watching a stranger say more true things about me in 90 seconds than my own mother had said in 40 years. Give my mother credit for one thing. She does not stay knocked down for long. Well, she said, forcing that too bright laugh back into her voice, reaching for her wine like it was a life preserver. Isn't that just Howard? Why on earth didn't you tell us any of this? All these years, and you never said a word about a medal. There it was. The pivot. Not an apology. Not even close. Just my mother rewriting the last 30 seconds into a story where the silence was my failure, not hers. I tried telling you, I said. You asked about the shrimp cocktail. A few muffled sounds around the table, someone trying not to laugh, someone else trying not to gasp. Constance's hand tightened on mine. That's not fair, my mother said, color rising in her cheeks now, real anger starting to show under the composure. I have always been proud of both my sons. You've never once called it that, I said. Not once. You called Delaney my son the attorney. You call me he does woodworking. You called me tonight, at 2 a.m, to tell me to keep my mouth shut so I wouldn't embarrass this family in front of the colonel. I watched that land. I watched Colonel Whitaker's expression shift from shock to something colder, something that looked a lot like disappointment, aimed squarely at my mother. You told him to be quiet, Whitaker said slowly, like he was making sure he understood correctly, about this? She didn't know about this, Delaney said quickly, jumping in to defend her, the way he always had, the way golden children learn to run interference for the parent who built the throne they're sitting on. None of us knew. That's not fair to put on her. It's entirely fair, Constance said. It was the first thing she'd said all night, and her voice was calm, level, the voice she uses when she's about to say something she's been sitting on for a long time. Because it was never really about the medal, or the accident, or the woodworking. It was about who got to be proud of, and who got to be managed. Howard spent his whole adult life being managed by this family. Tonight's just the first time anybody outside it noticed. Harmony hadn't said anything through any of it, but she was watching her father with an expression I recognized, because I'd worn it myself a few times growing up. The look of a kid realizing a parent is about to do something she'll respect long after she's forgotten most of the evening's small talk. A few seats down, one of Harmony's aunts, a woman I hadn't been introduced to, leaned toward her husband and whispered something behind her napkin. He shook his head slightly, the universal signal for don't. Not now. Nobody at that table was eating anymore. The waitstaff had stopped circling, hovering instead near the kitchen doors like they too sensed this wasn't a room that wanted to be interrupted by a plate of salmon. Mr. Langley, Harmony said finally, turning to me, using my last name for the first time all evening, formal in a way that felt almost like respect. My father doesn't talk about that convoy. Ever, in all the years since it happened. I think I've heard him mention it maybe 3 times. And only ever in the context of a man he never found. I need you to understand what it means that he's saying all of this out loud, in front of strangers, at my engagement dinner. I think I understand it fine, I said. I was there too. I could have stopped there. Honestly, I thought about it. Let the Colonel's reveal stand on its own. Let my mother sit with the discomfort of being publicly corrected by a decorated officer at her own son's engagement dinner. That would have been enough for most people. It wasn't enough for me, not that night. Because there was one more thing nobody at that table knew. Not my mother. Not Delaney. Not even Constance knew the full amount, though she knew there was something. Since we're telling the truth tonight, I said, and something in my voice made the whole table go quiet again. There's something else you should probably hear. My mother's eyes narrowed, wary now, sensing she wasn't done being surprised. 4 years ago, when the market dropped and your investments took a hit, I said, looking directly at her. You told everyone you downsized because you wanted something smaller. You told the neighbors, you told Delaney, you told the whole book club. You never told anyone that you'd have lost the house completely if I hadn't been covering your mortgage payments every single month since then. The table went so still I could hear the string quartet 2 rooms over. Howard, my mother said, her voice suddenly very small. That's not something we need to discuss here. Why not? I said. You had no problem discussing my woodworking in front of the Colonel's entire family. Why does the money embarrass you more than the workshop does? Delaney was staring at her now. Really staring. The way you look at someone when a floor you thought was solid just showed you a crack running clean through it. Wait, you've been paying Mom's mortgage? For 4 years? Why didn't you tell me? Because you never asked how she was affording the house after the market crashed, I said. None of you ever ask how anything gets paid for. It just happens. Like magic. And I've watched this family build an entire personality around being comfortable, successful, put together, and I let them believe that, because I didn't need the credit. I didn't need to be thanked. I just needed, one time, to not be introduced as the embarrassment, while I was quietly the reason the roof stayed over her head. I looked at my mother. Really looked at her, maybe for the first time in years without flinching first. You told me to keep my mouth shut tonight so I wouldn't embarrass you, I said. I've been keeping my mouth shut for you for 4 years. I think we're even. Here's the thing about revenge you don't plan. The kind that just happens because the truth finally has nowhere left to hide. It doesn't feel like triumph in the moment. It feels like watching a building you used to live in quietly catch fire, and realizing you're not going to run back in to save it. My mother looked around the table for someone to back her up. She looked at Delaney first, out of habit, the way she'd looked at him her whole life to confirm that the world was still arranged the way she preferred it. Delaney didn't say anything. He just looked down at the tablecloth, jaw working, the realization settling into him, not sympathy for her, I realized. Something closer to shame. Shame that he'd spent 37 years accepting a version of his brother that had never been true, because it was more comfortable than asking questions. She looked at Harmony next, maybe hoping the fiancé's politeness would extend some grace her way. Harmony just glanced at her father, then back at me, something like respect settling into her expression that had nothing to do with manners. Finally, my mother looked at Colonel Whitaker, and I watched her realize, in real time, that the one person in the room whose opinion she'd been most desperate to protect all night was the same person least inclined to give her an inch. Mrs. Langley Whitaker said, his voice measured, formal, the voice of a man who has delivered difficult news to families before. and knows exactly how much weight each word carries. I've spent 30 years around soldiers. I've seen every kind of family a soldier can come home to, the ones who understand what it cost him, and the ones who'd rather he just get back to normal so they don't have to think about it. He set his napkin down beside his plate, a small, final gesture. I think you're the second kind, he said, and I think you've known it for a long time. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because your son just sat at this table and let you humiliate him in front of strangers, and instead of apologizing, you asked why he never mentioned a medal. That tells me everything I need to know about how this family works. I want to be honest about something, because this isn't a story where I stood up, said something perfect, and watched my mother collapse into tearful realization, while years of buried love came pouring out, and we hugged it out over dessert. That's not what happened. That's not what this is. My mother didn't cry. She got angry. The tight, controlled anger of a woman who has never once in her life admitted she was wrong about anything, and wasn't about to start in a room full of witnesses. This is absurd, she said, standing up so fast her chair scraped loud against the floor. I am not going to sit here and be lectured by a man I've known for 20 minutes about how I raised my sons. Howard, we are leaving. Now, I'm not going anywhere, I said. And I'm not your son to order around anymore. Not like that. Not after tonight. Excuse me? You called me at 2 in the morning, I said, to tell me to be quiet, so I wouldn't embarrass you. You've spent 15 years introducing me like an apology. And tonight, the first time anyone outside this family found out who I actually am, your first instinct wasn't pride. It was panic that you'd been caught not knowing. I stood too, slower, more deliberate. No scraping chair. No scene beyond what was already unfolding. I'm done keeping your secrets, I said. The mortgage stops this month. You can explain the downsizing story to the neighbors however you'd like. I'm sure you'll think of something. While my mother gathered her purse with shaking hands, refusing to look at anyone, Colonel Whitaker crossed the room and stood in front of me, closer now. His voice dropped low enough that it felt private, just between us, even with the whole table still watching. I owe you a debt I can't repay with a dinner, he said. But I'd like to try, starting with something smaller. There's a program I run now that I didn't run back then, helping veterans transition, get their footing, find work that fits the men they've become instead of the men they were before they enlisted. I'd like you to be part of it, not as a favor, because you're exactly the kind of man other veterans need to see standing in front of them. I thought about my workshop, about the quiet satisfaction of taking something broken and making it useful again, about how that had always felt like the closest thing to peace I had access to after everything. I'd like that, I said. Good, Whitaker said. He extended his hand, and I shook it. Firm, the kind of handshake that means something between two people who've been through fire together, even if 17 years and an ocean of silence separated the moment we met from the moment we finally spoke. For what it's worth, he added, quieter still, my daughter's about to marry into a family I have real reservations about. But she's not marrying your mother. She's marrying your brother, and if he's got even half the character his older brother does, buried under whatever this family did to him, then maybe there's hope for him yet. He glanced past me at Delaney, who was still sitting there, silent, staring at his own hands like they belonged to a stranger. That's between them, Whitaker said. You and I have other work to do. My mother left first, Delaney trailing after her with a look on his face I'd never seen him wear before, somewhere between guilt and disorientation. A man realizing the map he'd been using his whole life had never actually matched the territory. He paused at the door and looked back at me. Howard, he said, I didn't know about any of it. The medal. The mortgage. I should have asked. Yeah, I said. You should have. I didn't soften it. I didn't tell him it was fine, that I understood, that we'd figure it out. Because we weren't going to figure it out. Not that night. And maybe not ever. And I was done pretending that silence was the same thing as peace. He nodded once, like he understood that too, and followed our mother out into the parking lot, into a car ride I imagine was very quiet. Constance and I stayed a little longer. Harmony hugged me before we left, unprompted, whispered that she was sorry, that she hadn't known, that she hoped I'd still come to the wedding even after tonight. We'll see, I said honestly, because I didn't know yet. and I wasn't going to promise something I couldn't be sure I'd want to give. Constance drove. My hands were shaking slightly, the adrenaline finally catching up to me now that the room wasn't watching anymore. Now that it was just us and the dark road along the coast. The ocean somewhere out there, past the guardrail, invisible in the night. "You okay?" she asked. "I don't know yet," I said. Honestly, I've spent 15 years imagining what it would feel like if she ever found out. I always thought it would feel like winning. Doesn't feel like winning? Feels like finally putting down something heavy, I said. Which isn't the same thing. Winning would mean she changes. This just means I stop carrying her. Constance reached over and took my hand off my knee, held it the rest of the way home, the streetlights sliding gold across the windshield, the radio low, neither of us needing to fill the silence with anything else. Somewhere past the harbor, she broke the quiet. "Paxton would have loved watching that happen," she said. "You should call him tomorrow. Tell him the colonel from your story finally found you, and that he did it at an engagement dinner in front of your mother and half the Danvers Club membership roster." That got a real laugh out of me. The first one all night, short and a little disbelieving. Like my body needed permission before it would let go of the tension it had been holding since the phone rang at 2 that morning. "He'll want the whole thing in writing," I said. "He's been telling people for years I underplay everything that happened over there." "Well, you did," Constance said. "For 17 years, you underplayed the whole thing to the one audience who actually should have known better. Guess that's over now." "Guess it is." We drove the rest of the way without saying much else, past the dark shapes of the hills against the sky, past my own workshop with its window still lit from a timer I'd forgotten to reset, past all the ordinary landmarks of a life I'd built quietly, brick by brick, while my family told a much smaller story about who was building it. I didn't know it yet, but that was the last dinner I would ever attend with my mother in the same room, not because of some dramatic falling out that followed, because there was simply nothing left to say that hadn't already been said, in front of witnesses in a banquet room that smelled like candle wax. On a night I never planned, and could never have predicted. I stopped paying my mother's mortgage that month, exactly like I said I would. I found out later, through Harmony, that Eloise did eventually have to sell the house and move into something smaller, something that actually matched the story she'd been telling the neighbors for years. I felt, if I'm honest, almost nothing when I heard it. Not satisfaction, not guilt, just the flat quiet of a debt finally settled. Harmony told me the new place was a modest 2-bedroom condo a few miles inland. Nothing like the house my mother had spent 4 years pretending she'd chosen for its charm rather than its price. I never saw it myself. I never asked to. There was a version of me, once, that might have driven past just to look. Just to confirm the story with my own eyes the way I'd confirmed so many other stories about my family over the years without ever being told the truth outright. That version of me didn't survive the dinner at the Danvers Club. Whatever curiosity I used to have about my mother's approval, about proving something to her, about waiting for the day she'd finally see me the way Colonel Whitaker had seen me in 90 seconds flat, all of it had burned off that night, like fog off the harbor in the early morning. And it never came back. Paxton called a week or two after the story made its way through the small circle of people who'd known both of us since the service. He laughed for a solid minute before he could get a full sentence out. 17 years I've been telling you to stop hiding that medal in a drawer, he said, and it takes your brother's future father-in-law recognizing your face across a dinner table to finally get the truth out into the open. I'd have paid good money to see your mother's face. You'd have loved it, I told him. Front row seat to the whole thing. Next time, he said, invite me. I'll bring popcorn. I told him there wouldn't be a next time, not with my mother, not at that scale, and he said that was probably for the best. Some scenes only need to happen once to do their work properly. Delaney called a few times in the months that followed. I answered some of them. The first real conversation happened maybe 6 weeks after the dinner, on an evening when I was closing up the workshop, sweeping sawdust into a pile I'd empty out back before locking the doors. I've been thinking about what you said, he told me. No preamble, like he'd been rehearsing the opening line for days, and needed to get it out before he lost his nerve. About nobody asking how anything gets paid for. I've been going back through every conversation we've had in probably the last decade, and I can't find one where I asked you a real question about your life. Not one, Howard. I asked about the weather. I asked if the shop was busy. I never once asked what 6 years in the army actually did to you. No, I said. You didn't. I'm not asking for forgiveness, he said. I don't think I've earned the right to ask for that yet. I just wanted you to know I noticed. That has to count for something, even if it's not enough. It counts for something, I said. It's not everything, I know. A pause, static on the line, the sound of him exhaling somewhere on the other end. Can I ask you something? The mortgage. Why didn't you ever tell me? Specifically. Not Mom. Me, I thought about that for a long moment before I answered. Because you were the one person in this family I thought might actually understand, if I explained it right. And some part of me didn't want to find out I was wrong about that too. He didn't say anything for a while. When he finally spoke again, his voice had changed, gone quieter, more honest than I think I'd heard it since we were kids sharing a room before he got old enough to want his own space. His own name attached to his own accomplishments, separate from mine. I'm sorry, he said, for all of it. For letting her build the story the way she wanted it built, year after year, without ever pushing back. I didn't tell him it was fine. I wasn't ready to say that, and I wasn't sure I ever would be. But I didn't hang up on him either, which was its own kind of answer, the only one I had available that night. We talked, carefully, in the weeks after that, like two men rebuilding a bridge that had never really been finished in the first place, testing each board before putting weight on it. Neither of us in a hurry to declare the thing safe to cross. He and Harmony got married the following spring, at a small ceremony overlooking the water. I went. Constance went with me. My mother was there too, seated at a different table, and we exchanged maybe a dozen words the entire evening, all of them polite, none of them warm. The one real exchange we had came near the end of the night, out by the edge of the reception where the string lights gave out and the dark water took over. She found me there alone, refilling my glass at a side table, and stood beside me for a moment, before speaking. You've done well for yourself, she said, looking out at the water instead of at me. The workshop, the program with the colonel. I hear people talk about you differently now. I haven't changed, I said, just the story other people tell about me. She was quiet for a moment, her jaw working the way it always did when she was choosing whether to say something honest or something safe. She chose safe, the way she always had. Well, I'm glad it's working out, she said, and then she excused herself to find Delaney. And that was the whole conversation. No apology tucked inside it, no admission that the story she'd told for 40 years had been wrong, only that the ending of it had turned out better than she expected. I watched her walk away across the lawn, pearls catching the last of the string lights, and felt nothing reach for her the way it used to. Not anger, not longing for something different. Just a kind of settled quiet. The same quiet you feel walking past a house you used to live in, and realizing it doesn't pull at you anymore. That's what I mean when I say there was no forgiveness. No tearful reconciliation. No moment where she finally said the thing I'd waited my whole life to hear. She never apologized. Not really. Not in a way that meant anything. Some people don't have that in them. And I stopped waiting for it to appear. What I got instead was better, in its own way. Colonel Whitaker kept his word. I started volunteering with his veterans program within a month, spending my evenings talking to men and women my age and younger, some of them carrying wounds you could see, and some carrying the kind you can't, and for the first time in years. I felt like the 6 years I'd spent in a uniform meant something beyond a story my own family had decided wasn't worth telling. The first evening I showed up, a younger man, maybe 26 or 27, sat across from me in a folding chair in the community room Whitaker had rented out near the harbor, and asked me flat out why anyone should listen to a stranger about what he was going through. You shouldn't, I told him. Not because I'm a stranger. Because I spent 17 years assuming nobody in my own life wanted to hear about it either, so I stopped offering. Don't make my mistake. Find the people who will actually listen, even if it takes you a while to figure out who they are. He didn't say much back that night. He came back the next week anyway, and the week after that, and eventually he started talking, and I started listening. And somewhere in that folding chair, I realized Whitaker hadn't just given me an apology dressed up as an opportunity. He'd handed me back a piece of who I used to be before my family convinced me it wasn't worth mentioning. My workshop grew too, strange as that sounds. Whitaker mentioned me to a few people, word got around, and suddenly the man who did woodworking had more custom orders than he could keep up with. Restored dining tables, rebuilt porch railings, a set of cabinets for a retired Navy captain who'd heard the whole story secondhand and wanted, in his words, the guy who doesn't need the credit to build his kitchen. I hired a second set of hands that winter for the first time since opening the place. Funny how a life can shift shape entirely in the space of one dinner, one sentence, one man who happened to remember a face from the worst night of his own life and refused to let the room stay quiet about it. Constance likes to remind me, on the nights I get quiet thinking about all of it, that none of that growth came from my mother finally seeing me clearly. It came from a stranger who had every reason to have forgotten my face entirely, and didn't. There's something almost funny about that, in a bitter sort of way, that the family who shared my blood needed someone from outside it to explain who I was. Whitaker and I got dinner together, just the two of us, a handful of times that first year, not banquet rooms with string quartets. Just a quiet table at a place near the harbor where nobody was performing for an audience. He told me things that first dinner that he said he'd never told his own wife in all their years married. Details about that convoy he'd carried alone because he didn't think anyone who hadn't been there could hold the weight of them properly. I understood that better than most people could. I'd been carrying my own version of the same weight, quietly, for 17 years, waiting for someone to ask the right question so I could finally set it down. You know what the strange part is, he said to me over that first dinner, turning his glass slowly on the tablecloth. I used to imagine finding you 100 different ways. In my head it was always some dramatic reunion, a VA hospital, a reunion event, something with weight to it. I never once imagined it would happen at my own daughter's engagement dinner, with your mother standing right there telling me not to bother asking about you. Life's got a strange sense of timing, I said. It does, he agreed. Good thing too. I don't think I would have believed it if it happened any other way. We still meet for dinner every so often, now, not out of obligation. Out of something closer to the kind of steady friendship that gets built between two men who've stood on opposite ends of the same worst night of their lives, and come out the other side of it, able to sit across a table from each other, in comfortable quiet. The Veterans Program grew too, over that first year, from a folding chair operation in a rented community room, to something with an actual budget and a waiting list of its own. I built the furniture for the new space myself, a long communal table where the men and women who came through could sit together instead of scattered in a circle of mismatched chairs, because I'd learned a long time ago, sitting at my own family's dinner tables, that the shape of the furniture in a room says something about how welcome you're meant to feel in it. On the anniversary of the workshop's opening that year, Constance surprised me by inviting a small group over: Paxton, a few of the veterans from the program, Whitaker and his wife, Harmony and Delaney. Not my mother. I hadn't asked her, and nobody at the table seemed to notice the absence as anything other than the natural shape the evening was always going to take. We ate out on the back patio, string lights strung between the fence posts instead of a chandelier, real food instead of catered salmon, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, nobody at the table needed a 3-word summary to understand who I was. They already knew. I hadn't had to prove a single thing to any of them, and there was a kind of peace in that I hadn't expected to feel this early, so soon after a dinner that had upended everything I thought I understood about my own family. Delaney raised a glass at some point that night, a little clumsily, the way people do when they're not used to speaking without notes, prepared in advance. To Howard, he said, who I'm only now starting to actually know, 17 years too late, but better late than never. Nobody corrected the timeline. Nobody needed to. Everyone at that table understood exactly what he meant, and for once, that quiet understanding was more than enough. A family. Finally, learning how to sit at the same table without anyone needing to perform for the rest of the room. People ask me sometimes, usually after they've heard some version of the story secondhand, whether I regret saying what I said that night. Whether I wish I'd handled it differently, kept the mortgage quiet, let the Colonel's reveal be the whole story, instead of pulling my mother's other secret into the light along with it. I don't regret it. Not for a second. My mother spent 40 years deciding which parts of me were worth introducing to a room. She never asked about the limp. never asked about the scar on my neck. Never once, in all those years, wondered out loud what her older son had actually done with 6 years of his life before he picked up a chisel and started fixing broken furniture in a rented workshop off State Street. It took a stranger, a colonel who'd spent 17 years looking for a face he couldn't name, to say out loud what she should have known all along. That I wasn't the embarrassment. I was the son who kept the family standing while nobody was looking, in more ways than one, and I never once asked to be thanked for it. Some people, when they hear the story, want it to end differently. They want my mother to have shown up at the workshop one afternoon, tearful, finally understanding, asking to start over. They want a scene where she says my name the way she used to say Delaney's, like it means something, like it's worth repeating to strangers at parties. I understand the impulse. Most stories about families are supposed to end that way, with enough time and enough hurt, finally wearing the hard edges down into something softer. Real life doesn't always cooperate with the ending people think a story deserves, and I stopped apologizing a long time ago for the fact that mine didn't. That's not what happened here, and I've made my peace with that. Some people don't soften. Some people just recalibrate, quietly, and keep moving forward as if the recalibration itself was the apology, and expect you to accept it as one. My mother recalibrated. She stopped introducing me as he does woodworking somewhere along the way. I noticed it at the wedding, actually, when she mentioned to a stranger near the gift table that I ran a very respected restoration business. No mention of the army. No mention of the medal. No mention of 17 years of silence she'd been complicit in building. Just a new summary to replace the old one, still missing every piece of me that actually mattered. I don't need her pride now. I stopped needing it the moment I watched her reach for her purse instead of reaching for an apology. That's the part people don't always understand when they hear this story secondhand, that the revenge, if that's what you want to call it, was never really about watching her get humiliated in that banquet room. It would have been easy to feel good about that in the moment, and call it even. The real settling of the account happened weeks later quietly, when I stopped waiting for her to become someone she was never going to become, and started building a life that didn't require her permission to feel complete. There's no clean word for that kind of ending. It isn't victory, exactly. And it isn't peace either. It's closer to what happens when you finally set down something you've been carrying so long you forgot your shoulders could sit level without it. Constance still traces the scar on my neck sometimes, late at night, when she thinks I'm asleep. I let her. It's the only part of that whole story I've ever wanted anyone to hold on to. Not the medal, not the mortgage, not the look on my mother's face when the truth finally caught up to the version of me she'd spent 40 years constructing. Just that scar, and the hand that traces it, and the quiet certainty that whatever I lost that night on that convoy, and whatever I lost in every dinner before this one, I came out the other side of both, with someone who never once needed a colonel's testimony to know exactly who I was. The rest of it, the dinner, the silence, my mother's face when the truth finally caught up to the story she'd been telling for 15 years. I don't need to hold on to that anymore. I just needed, one time, for the whole room to hear it. And they did. Every last word of it, in a banquet room off the harbor, with the string quartet still playing somewhere in the background like nothing had changed at all. Even though for me, absolutely everything had.